Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure, on behalf of Nancy Thomas, who arranged all of this but is unfortunately home with the flu this week, to introduce Dr. Roger Greer, who is the first of our 3 colloquium speakers as we're beginning a review of some curriculum. For those of you who may or may not know, Roger is a professor emeritus from SLIM. Rowcross professor as well. I don't have all the notes in front of me, so he's going to have to correct me, but he has also been dean at Syracuse in Southern California, and has also been on the faculty at the University of Denver. And we're very pleased to have Roger come and speak to us today. And I don't remember if I remember the title of your speech either, but
I don't either.
Okay. So Roger's going to talk to us about something, either of which you remember. So I'm going to turn it over here at this point in time to Roger. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yes.
Nancy has sent me an email and said, would you come and talk to the faculty and students? And I said, sure. A chance to go talk and somebody wants to listen was a real boon. So I said, sure, I'll do it. And the next thing I heard from Nancy was, have you thought of a title for your talk? And I thought, oh Jesus, what have I got myself into? She didn't say talk. She had said, have you thought of a title for your symposium? And that blew me off So I thought, I sent back and said, well, I'm going to excavate my 50 years of experience and make predictions about the future. She modified that to be mining the past in order to look at the future. So what it really amounts to is that I came here to have conversations with students and faculty, and not to make, I'll make pronouncements, of course. but a formal speech means that I had to go to the literature and find out what other people say and then quote them. And hell, when you're 77, I'm not going to go and quote anybody if there's anything I want to say it. So that's what I'm doing. I wanted to come and talk to you about what I think the future might be for graduates and well. When I told somebody I was coming, she said, well, what are you going to do, tell stories about World War II? So I thought I probably can't go back that far. But I really wanted to have conversations, and I wanted to start. I thought I would have a whole classroom full of shining young faces. Somehow, somebody pulled a trick on me. Because I wanted to say that 50 years ago this year, I was sitting in my first master's class at Rutgers University. And Rutgers was in its second class. The school had been started in 1954. This was fall of 55. And they had not been accredited yet. So that we were in more or less guinea pigs. The first class was pretty small. So we were the first bona fide class of students, and the faculty were excited about what they were doing. I want to come back to that because they were being innovative. All of the library programs around the country were calling themselves library science. School of Library Science, because being a science was the in thing in those days. Whether you acted like it or not, if you could call yourself a science, that gave you some legitimacy on campus. So library schools grabbed onto the label School of Library Science. Well, Rutgers, being innovative, said no. We're going to be the school, the graduate school of library service, and that concept of service suddenly being intruded into the design of the program was the catalyst that made the faculty excited about what they were going to do. Prior to that time, in library education, the University of Chicago, which was started in the late 20s and the 30s, aside, most programs were vocational programs of library housekeeping, for that matter. And the program that I enjoyed was still a lot vocational, but it was innovative because the user became part of the concept of library service. And if you start thinking in terms of what does the user need and what should a librarian be doing aside from housekeeping books, you open up a whole can of worms, which in effect was opening the door to the rest of the social sciences and marching out of the door with the humanities. So library science, library service, librarianship at that time was beginning the transition from a humanities orientation into a social science orientation, which was a step that was taken that has not yet been completed because we haven't persuaded ourselves. I didn't mean to get into that kind of a ramble, but I wanted to then call attention to the fact that I have had a career of 50 years. And I was 26 or 27 when I went to school. So now, if this room had been full of those shiny young scrubbed faces, I could say, well, your career is going to go 50 years into the future. I think they're going to diminish Social Security, and you may have to work longer than you planned, but I don't know if you'll make it for 50 years. Nevertheless, I will assume that you will, and my thoughts were, now, I was thinking about what I was going to tell you while swimming. When you're doing laps in a pool, and I have come up with a marvelous way of counting laps. You don't have to keep tabs because the little things along the side, I move one every time I've made a lap. Well, since I've got my counter operating, it's like an abacus. I can spend the swimming time thinking about some issue or other, and so I have thought about this talk repeatedly while I was working myself up to 16 laps or a half mile while swimming. So these are thoughts while swimming. There is a book by Lewis Thomas. I think the last one that he wrote that is Thoughts While Listening to Mahler. Mahler's Third Symphony or something like that. Well, I would write a book that said Thoughts While Doing Laps on my way to a half mile. The point of the 50-year thing is to say, if you go from here for 50 years, that's 2055. And there is not a wizard alive who can tell us what is this world going to look like in 2055 with any kind of authority. So students that are entering school now can plan on a 50-year career into an unknown that we don't have a clue is going to, what will its shape be, or what its design? I was thinking then that how do we get from here to there? How do they get from a program of learning now that will be of value to them 50 years from now or 49 years from now? Is there anything that they can take from this master's program that will enhance their career that far down the pike? And in looking at what would be left, you can say that technology is going to be superseded by technologies endlessly. Well, as a matter of fact, it was here at Emporia that we had a commencement speaker one summer who said in the year 2023, I think, that knowledge, the sum total of knowledge in the world, is going to be reproduced every 66 days. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. Do you remember that by any chance? Well, that really captured me. We were in the auditorium, and I, of course, immediately copied it and used it in my classes. And I have since been talking about it, and I, of course, lie and have changed the time span, and I haven't found any written evidence, but I figure my guess is pretty good. So I'm thinking that when this mythical student that I'm talking about is going to get ready to retire, knowledge will have been multiplied repeatedly, and probably will be doing so every 6 days. Because at the rate technology, and most of it will be technology, we sure as hell haven't learned a great deal about human nature that is changing. But technology is driving us ever faster. I heard on the Discovery Channel that nanotechnology is the next paradigm shift that's on the horizon. And I don't know enough about nanotechnology to even recite the words, but it's there and it's looming. So look for it, and don't get wiped out by it. Let me go back to 2055, and in thinking lapse, now I'm back and forth. And I thought, well, I ought to identify the world that I lived in 1955 and remind you the world that, well, you all look too young to have been very active in those times. But that was before we had automatic garage door openers. Before we had microwave ovens, before cell phones, before color TV. If you saw the Edward R. Murrow film, it was just about the time of that film. The film, I was living in Brooklyn at that time, and we used to stop and lean into the doorway of a corner bar to watch McCarthy's proceedings on TV. It was an Irish neighborhood, and they would yell and clap whenever McCarthy would make some inane comment that he was making in those days. Well, that was before color TV. Well, before many people had TV. Bars could afford it, but nobody else. It was barely into the period of automatic transmissions. If you got an automatic transmission on your car, you had to pay a heck of a lot extra, because that was a fancy doodad. No calculators. If you look around your house and say, what's recent? Almost everything that you see is recent from that time period. And starving students were closer to starving than students today. When I grew up on a farm in Minnesota in the 30s without electricity and running water, so that when I see poor people, they're rich to what I grew up with. Well, that period compared to today is almost primitive because of what technology has done in advancing our society. That period still generated the Joe McCarthys, and we still have the Russ Limbaughs and Joe McCarthy's modern counterparts with their sweeping challenges against their opposition. So that part hasn't changed. So we can say technology has changed, and it has changed our lives, and it has changed libraries. Talk about libraries. When I was taking a test in my master's class, the tests were reproduced on a spirit duplicator, whatever that gel was that you, what was that called?
The mimeograph.
What?
The mimeograph.
Ditto.
Well, it was before the mimeograph. You typed the mimeograph and it made a mat. But then there was the multi-lit, where it made holes in the mat.
Oh, yeah.
But before that, there was a gel that was a pan that you had to, do something, and then you could take off sheets. That's 54. Mind you, the atomic bomb had been dropped almost 10 years before that. So we were into the atomic age, but we had not gotten that far in terms of Xeroxing or duplicating or any of that technology that invaded the library shortly after that. After that came eventually the computer. The computer in the late 60s. I finished my PhD and went to Potsdam, New York as director in 64. And Clarkson College next door was giving a little tutorial for faculty and staff of the State University College of Potsdam and Clarkson on Fortran. Every afternoon for a week, for 3 weeks, we went there and the fellow taught us Fortran. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I remember about that is do loops that you would create when you were programming for Fortran. But we had our first computer, which was the 1060 or something like that, in the school, and that school created the first major in computer science. Libraries were not in any way, shape, or form associated with computers at that time. Now we're talking early 60s. Before going back for a PhD, I was running a cataloging department in Purdue. And I used to pride myself on being so with it as a manager that my department would take the books as they arrived from the jobber, and we would have it cataloged before the book ever got marked, because we took the proof slips from the Library of Congress, and I don't know, I suppose they still have something comparable that you can get online, but we would catalog it and reproduce the cards before the book ever arrived. So when we got it, we could mark it and put it on the shelf instantly. That was pretty much all by hand, and using a little handheld multi-lit to crank out cards. This is in the late 50s. So the world was, by comparison, very primitive. But it was changing, and changing faster than we realized. Well, for the student who's going to go to 2050, it occurred to me that there isn't anything that can be taught in this program that is going to equip a student to deal with those vocational issues in 2050. And that old saw is what this program must do for those students is help them to discover how they learn, because they're going to have to teach themselves for the rest of their lives. They're going to have to teach themselves, and they have to know how to do that for themselves. And that's one of the contributions the program can make. The second one is that what will be constant between now and 2055 is the student's head. It'll be the same head that's here in the classroom that's going to be a little grayer, a little balder. Well, rude people will say bald, but of course those of us who know the truth will recognize that we still have quite a bit of hair. But it's still going to be the same head and the same inside that is there in the classroom. So that a program is going to make the biggest contribution that works on that head. And on that, the work on that head, again, is to help students understand how they think, and how they analyze, and how they draw conclusions, and how to go about looking at reality to be able to draw those conclusions or make that analysis and draw the conclusion. And that's a pretty potent, heavy responsibility, because you can't just pick up a book that tells you how to do it. I think faculty have to work with students and not act as if we know all the answers, but act as if we will help and learn with them to help them get there. Mostly it's a question of not knowing all the answers of the issues that students will confront or do confront, but as being able to say, well, I've been thinking about this longer than you have, and let me help you from what I have learned about it, and go from there. But if the program is going to do anything for students, it must relate to what they're going to be in the future, which comes down to this dichotomy that programs are a combination of professional and vocational. How much vocational and how much professional is the age-old question in terms of library education. Certainly, a student has to have some vocational experience in the classroom in order to get that first job, because the conventional attitude of practicing librarians is to say that MLS graduates don't know anything, and they have to be taught everything they're going to need on the job. So they dismiss the library education very simply, mostly because they don't have a clue what's being taught in library school anymore. But that's both good and bad for a new graduate, because it diminishes that enthusiasm that you have when you've graduated, and makes you feel like you're starting at zero. That'll persist, but it isn't going to be there that long, because people who have that attitude are very likely not going to be drawing Social Security very long, because they're not going to thrive. I was going to say something about the corporations that have cut off the retirement programs, like GM and United Airlines and what have you. Anyway, so working with the head is what's important. The second part of this thing about what's going to be there in 2055 is in terms of vocational professional is the fact that people are still going to be users of information. And while Google will go on advancing and doing fancy things with technology, the library and information fields will thrive to the extent that they provide a value-added service. We need to make that value-added concept a core area within a master's curriculum. Let the technology provide the access to everything that's possible, and to do it with digital or analog or what have you. The technology is there, it can be used, and entrepreneurs like Google will come up with ways to do it. But as you probably all know, and others will learn, that you can go to Google and put in a term and then get 4,000 hits, and trying to figure out what it is you want is still the crux of it. And when knowledge doubles every 6 hours, it's going to be worse and worse and worse. I have to digress on this and point out that the real tragedy about this knowledge doubling every 6 hours is that people my age, in my youth, were deemed to be wise because they had experienced a lot, they knew a lot, and they had acquired wisdom, and they had diminished their passions for one thing or another. Well, when you double the knowledge that rapidly, the fallout is that people, as they grow older, know less and less about what's available to know, so that the universe grows bigger and their capacity to know about it gets smaller. So as you all get older, and I'm just warning you because it's on your plate, people are going to say, well, they don't know what in the hell's going on anyway. Because you don't, and you can hear your grandchildren, or I can hear my grandchildren, after I get done denouncing them for their language and their behavior and their attitudes about one thing or another. And then I hear them talk about their world, and it's obvious that I don't have a clue as to what it is their world is like from morning to night. Well, so if people are constant, technology, the vocational aspects of the field will be taken over by machines and what have you. It means that the real value-added component of a library program or an information program is to teach people how to diagnose needs. The needs assessment aspects of information services become the critical component. Somebody has to help that user identify through the Google what it is they're looking for, and when they get to 4,000 hits, be able to reduce it to 5. And most of us can't do that when we're searching. And that's going to get harder and harder because of the glut of information and the nanotechnology. So teaching people to diagnose need, in my estimation, is going to be almost the critical core function of a master's program in information services. That diagnostic process is the core of a professional part. Diagnosis requires the application of theory. vocational requires the application of rules, so that there is no customized process in the vocational. You learn the rules. You learn the rules of descriptive catalog, and you should be able to catalog descriptively by being able to identify what exists. But in order to satisfy a diagnosed need, you have to access subject headings, and you have to build profiles, and you have to. Am I stepping on your toes? Oh, okay. You have to focus on the characteristics of people. When we designed this curriculum, we said that there are 4 fields. There are based on questions that we have about people. First of all, the question is, how do people access information? How do they know they have an information need? What do they do when they become aware of it? What are the sources that they approach, or do they not do anything? There's a whole a series of questions that can be asked about individuals and their satisfying or searching for information. Putting that together and looking at those questions and listing them, the answers came to the idea of information psychology. And once we came up with the label of information psychology, it suddenly came to us that this is, for the information fields, what educational psychology is for education. Education psychology is really the engine that drives education in its intellectual thrust into society. The research that educational psychologists have done in the last 50 years, I think, is in the forefront of the social sciences and has been contributing to all of the social sciences. Where is the research on the information psychology? John does a little bit, but he's not really dig holes in it yet. I just thought of that as I was looking at it. So the core field in the future is information psychology, in my estimation, because it focuses on people. And that realm of information psychology, we've got the evidence of educational psychology, how that has proliferated into areas of education and had an impact. We need to have the same impact. It needs to tell us how to develop and provide services. The second area then was to say, how does a society create new knowledge? And how do they record that knowledge so that it becomes information? I'm assuming you all know those definitions. I have all of my 801 transparencies, so and all those definitions. So if you have questions, I can put those up and answer them instantly because I can't remember. How does a society record that knowledge? How does it mass produce that knowledge? How does it disseminate that information or knowledge? How does it organize that knowledge? How does it retrieve that knowledge? How does it diffuse? Disseminating is putting it in front of people. Diffusing it is getting it into their heads. How does it diffuse that knowledge? How does it store that knowledge? How does it discard it? That then becomes the sociology of information. How a society relates to that field. That was evolved into 803. At the University of Southern California, it was 503. So I find my head reverting back to the 500 level numbers. The third one was to say, okay, how does an information organization operate? How is it managed differently than any other organization? And why does it have to be different? Or how much of management theory is relevant to information organizations? And what are the variables in society that influence the nature of that organization? And the answer to those questions evolves into information organization management. The fourth one is how does a person build a database to serve a population? What are the components? What are the constraints? What are the parameters of that database that will make it appropriate for a particular client population, whether it's individuals, organizations, groups, or what have you? That became, here it was 8:15, but it became, 8:05, I think. Anyway, it became the fourth field. And that evolution is at least 20 years old. The question is, and the consequence of it was the curriculum at the University of Southern California that Bob brought here. The question is, has it endured? Will that framework, will that concept endure for the next 50 years so that it can provide the kind of education that those students will need when they're headed toward 2055? At this point, I used to have all those things on my blackboard in the seminar room at the University of Southern California, and I would spend hours with PhD students looking at it. And it was important to remember that all we had when we drew those matrices and boxes and perspectives was a diagram. It did not have any content. The content needed to be filled in by people, by the world. And I used to yell to people, don't assume that this has any secret message here. It's a roadmap. It doesn't do anything for you until you do it. PhD students could look at it and say, because it was a nice matrix, and they could pick out a square and say, this is where I'm going to do my dissertation. And it was very useful for that. But that's like any other roadmap. It'll tell you where you are and what's near you and where you want to go. So those four fields I still see as the core of what to educate a student to do in order to have a productive career. And you have to give them enough instruction in managing the technology of the day so that they can be prepared to continue to learn the technology of the future. Then, well, I see people falling off their chairs. I thought you're pretty remarkable in your ability to suppress your excitement. I could go on for a bit, or I could stop and have you stand up and stretch and decide whether you want to ask any questions. Which do you want? Which should I?
There's questions. Any questions?
So what?
See if there are questions.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? Anybody?
Doesn't the focus on people as users of information, doesn't that assume an actual caring about other people? I mean, in other words, if we have students come to the program and they really don't care about the people, can you teach that?
No, they should be sent to community colleges and learn the vocational aspects of the field. and be encouraged to do that, because we need those people in libraries. But we don't need them to clutter up the profession with their knowledge of rules, because they're not going to take the profession any place in terms of research or adding more theory. Our biggest problem is that we have been a vocationally oriented occupation for 5,000 years. The last 100 years we've been struggling to get out of that. So have a lot of other professions, because the social sciences came into existence. But we haven't gotten very far. We have contributed very little to the knowledge base of the social sciences, because we think we're going to be modern when we get a new piece of technology, and we run with the technology. Right now we're I think the blush of the internet is wearing off, so that we might be ready for the next nano something or other. And then we can feel good about ourselves because we have mastered that technology. We still use the computer as an evidence of our seriousness and our scholarship and so on. That's nonsense. And we haven't, because we have dwelt in that world, we have not contributed to society's issue, which I see is wrapped up in a very clear understanding of the national and regional and local information infrastructure in a society. Right now we're in a phase in society where we're caught up in this zeal for infrastructure. We're concerned about the infrastructure for catastrophes. Katrina brought us to our knees. We're concerned about the infrastructure for dealing with bird flu. We're concerned about the infrastructure for 9/11. You pick an area, and one of the issues then that's being discussed in Congress in particular, but in the intellectual community, is how has society organized itself to deal with those issues. That's an infrastructure issue. We're at that time in our evolution, I think. We need to do the same thing for the information professions. We've done it, and as a lifelong Democrat, it pains me to say this, but Eisenhower did an enormous amount to contribute to the concept of a national transportation infrastructure in promoting the interstate system in this country, where you began thinking in terms of highways and railroads and state police and gas stations and automobile manufacturers, all as part of the same system. We haven't done it for information. When you see any definition of information infrastructure, it's labeled in terms of technology. The internet is our infrastructure. Well, that's like the railroad, as if that were the end, the beginning and the end. And I'm going to preach to PhD students this afternoon about that. I believe a school like Emporia could make a difference if you would select a topic like the infrastructure and say, this is what we're going to stand for. This is what we want to explore. That everything I've said about student learning can be done within the framework of an information infrastructure, so that students can see exactly where they would fit now or in the future as they evolve. That was a short answer.
I actually have two questions, but I'll just ask my first one. How does an information organization operate? How is it unique? I ask this of you.
That was a good question when we came up with the idea. And we said to ourselves, why, in managing it, designing it is one thing, managing it is another, and what is its product, so that we had to talk about what are the variables that are going to influence the design and management of that organization. But the fundamental one is what is it going to do for whom? And in many respects, it's not going to be unique to other organizations. If you talk generically, the people, buildings, stuff. But that product is very elusive. The product is satisfaction, the resolution of a need. And that's as far as we got with that answer, because that's an important question that needs to be asked and researched. And you can't come up with a gimmicky answer that I think holds up. I think the question holds up. But all the answers that I could come up with, I still am a little queasy about because I don't know.
And yet you think it is a unique organization because of the product?
I believe that, but I don't know that.
Okay. Thank you.
I was around when you brought the new curriculum in, and during the Camelot days at SLIM, when things were so exciting, the ideas were flying like crazy. And I also was working with the distance program and hearing from other library schools, and it really set the whole library world on its ear for a while, of library education. And it was shocking, and there were changes, and it was moving from skills to theory, and it seems like it's kind of reverted back to becoming smaller instead of growing bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
That's a comment. What do you think?
I'm not sure I heard everything we said, but when we started the curriculum in California, and we offered the curriculum for, 4 or 5 years, and then the university, as a private university, said I was the dean, and they new president, new provost, confronted me, and they said, we're a private university. Proposition 13 has passed. We have to be concerned with the issue is how is this university going to survive to the year 2015? And why should we support your field? And that was pretty blunt stuff. The curriculum was well received in California, and we were well received on campus as an intellectual contributor. But the dollars and cents of this library field were pretty compelling evidence that, well, and he went on and said, you don't have any big donors, you don't have any big research piles that you can draw on. You've got people who care and there's enthusiasm, but they don't have any money. And we have to be concerned about supporting the law school and the medical school. And well, when he got done, I said, you're wrong. But I didn't have any answers other than that we were on the right track to do the right thing. So we made an impact, and then bless Bob Grover, he brought this curriculum here, and it lived and thrived. I'm not sure exactly what it is today, but it is properly evolved as the way it should. But we haven't had a big impact on the world, I don't think. But then I'm retired. I don't go to ALA anymore, and my friends that I still communicate with by email, we're talking about our prostate. So we haven't addressed any of these major issues. So I didn't answer your question.
No.
In response to the effect on the field, it is hard to say precisely, but the trends in the last 15 years have been toward interdisciplinary an interdisciplinary view and bringing in the social sciences, to some extent the sciences, but certainly the social sciences into our field.
Yes.
And you see that across curriculum areas. And certainly USC and Emporia State were among the first to be doing that. So it is hard to say what the impact is.
We have had an
There has
impact.
been an impact.
I think Marty Hale and I and Herbert and Bob did about 150 workshops around the country on needs assessment. And I should have pointed out that those workshops became the core of this curriculum. So that when I talk about information psychology as the theoretical base of what we should be about, the practical side is needs assessment. And I think that every student needs to be versed in a methodology for assessing needs in various environments with various populations. So those needs assessment workshops have had an impact around the country, I think. But I was looking at an ALA something the other day about what's happening, and I didn't see even a hint that anybody was talking about needs assessment. So when you think you've got, we were all so excited and enthusiastic, we thought we're going to save the world. We were young.
If I could make a comment, Roger, University of South Carolina, Dan Barron is still there. Needs assessment is very much at the forefront because he is one of your biggest fans.
I heard he's retiring.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and that's too bad. Because I don't have that many fans around anymore.
Roger, yesterday in discussions with the faculty, we talked about the specific advantages for the SLUM faculty to be based in this university and what we could draw on to in the normal cycle of experiencing a curriculum and then redesigning it. Could you talk about some of those advantages, some of those resources?
I was thinking about that again when in coming out here and talking with Kelly, and when I first came here from Southern California again. Now I had been in Potsdam, New York when I got my PhD, which is a college similar to this. It had been a teacher's college and was being converted into a liberal arts college. Those were the days when Rockefeller was governor and he was spending $1 billion on the 57 units of the State University of New York. So I had participated in the excitement of that college suddenly trying to make the transition from teacher's college to a liberal arts college. And I had been at Rutgers getting a PhD, and I taught while I was getting my PhD. In those days, we had instructors, a tenured position, so you were about regular faculty, but you were nobody in the grand scheme of things. But I still taught in the program and went from being the worst teacher in the school to being one of the better ones by the time I finished my degree. So I had some experience, and I had been at Purdue, experience with the so-called large institutions in the country, and realized that and then subsequently at Syracuse and University of Southern California, and to a lesser extent the University of Denver, that large campuses that seem to collect prestige based on how much research money they bring into the campus and who they can buy to be on their faculty are the desired place to be. It's like going to work at the Library of Congress. It's the biggest library in the country, therefore it's the best place to be. And I can't imagine an organization that I would less like to be part of than the Library of Congress. The bureaucracy would be unbelievable. Well, large universities are places where you have huge walls erected between the various schools and the various disciplines, and students and graduate students and faculty rarely penetrate the walls of other schools and disciplines. So it's like a bunch of, if you imagine a feudal landscape with castles around and moats, and the idea of keeping those bastards at bay so that we can do our thing. You've got a sense of what the large university environment is like. And what I was saying yesterday in thinking about Emporia, this school has a remarkable opportunity, and students similarly, because of the size, because of the fact that faculty live next to each other, and that they shop next to each other. They run into each other when they go out and recreational activities. Those walls don't exist here, and they can't exist here. People have friends who cut across not just the other disciplines on campus, but other lifestyles in the community, because it's a small community and relatively friendly, except we were run over this morning. But that must have been somebody from KU or something. But that's an asset. There aren't many schools that have that. And students, and here, if a faculty member, let's say you want to, when we talk about theory, you want to say, well, what is a theory? What am I talking about when I'm on this topic? You can get on the phone here on campus and call somebody and say, what am I thinking of? What does this mean? Who should I read? What can I do? It is a remarkable experience to be in this environment and recognize that it's a positive place to be, rather than the conventional wisdom, which is to say, oh, it's nowhere. You don't want to go there because there's nothing there. Well, that's nonsense. In my 50 years, and I remember way back about 1960 something or other, must have been the 70s, I went to Denver from New Jersey or New York to interview as dean of the school at the University of Denver. And I had been to an SLA meeting in Minneapolis. Now my home is Minnesota, but I had spent 25 years in the East when I got out of the Army. And when I went to Denver and interviewed for a day, I realized this was too far away from anything. That I didn't want to be in Denver because the action was in the East Coast. I had worked in Brooklyn, and I had worked in New York State, and worked in New Jersey, and that's where the action was. It was the attitude I had, and it took me a long time to discover how provincial and silly that was. In 1975, I taught summer school at the University of Denver, and realized that the sun shines every day. In Syracuse, you don't know that. And I discovered that I'm from Minnesota, and I grew up that way. And I don't want to live here. I don't want to go back to Syracuse anymore. So they offered me a job later on, and I took it. And all my friends from the East Coast said, "Are you crazy? This is already in the 70s. People were still that provincial about the West." And I guess if we think of the blue states and the red states, there's some more of that still around. But the moral of the story is, Emporia can be the center of the universe if you want it to be. But you have to want it to be. And you have to believe it can be. Which leads me to one more point. As students and as faculty, you have to have fun. 50 years, I look back and I think, well, I was on my way to getting a PhD in history, a master's degree in history at Columbia when I transferred to Rutgers. The Korean GI Bill allowed you one change of program. So I was writing the thesis for my master's degree. Still had not passed the German exam, but I was writing the thesis. And we went to Minnesota. My wife was a librarian. That's another story. She was my post-librarian in Europe, in the Army, and had signed a contract with the Army. But I went to Minnesota. I wanted to go home to teach history in high school, and I was going to be the world's greatest history teacher, and I was going to have my master's from Columbia University. And we went around to half a dozen cities in Minnesota, and they would say, "Can you teach shop?" or "Can you coach basketball?" And I would say, "No, I want to teach history." My wife was pregnant with our first child. Her belly was out to here, and they looked at her and they would say, "Are you a librarian?" She would say yes. He said, "God, we'd hire you in a minute." So we went back to Brooklyn, and I said, "I'm going to get a library degree, and I'll finish the history degree later." Well, and that's how I got to Rutgers. And my intention was to get the library degree and get a job in a university library and then get a PhD. In 1959, I went to ALA in Washington and discovered this is my field. The history became the avocation, and the library field was my real field. So my advice is, you've got to have fun. You have to really enjoy what you're doing. If you're not enjoying it most of the time, get out of it. Do something else. Life is way too short. And I can look back. I had a stint in the Navy at the end of World War II, and I had a 3-year hitch in the Army during the Korean War, and I had 50 years as a career. It doesn't get any fuller than that. And here I'm 77, and somebody wanted to hear what I had to say. That's a remarkable experience. So have fun. That's my advice. Here's some questions that I didn't answer. I saw a hand.
In lieu of that other hand, how does a librarian or an information professional build a database for service to a population that would differ than a non-librarian?
Subject headings.
Subject headings?
For example, accessing. If you use the points of access that include the vocabulary of that client population rather than the vocabulary of the Library of Congress, or some other external standard source, you're coming closer to customizing. You can get the vocabulary by getting a focus group or going around and listening to them or making a list and trying it out. The main point is to customize. I used to say to public librarians, organize your collection to fit people. When I first went to work in a public library in Linden, New Jersey, we hid the fiction in the far corner of the room so that people would have to walk through the non-fiction area and in order to get to the fiction. Because maybe if they walked through the non-fiction, they might pick up some serious book and that would do them some good instead of the frivolous fiction. Well, that was 1955. We've come a long way since then, and that was before paperbacks became standard in libraries. But that was organizing. Oh, there's a whole. I've got another hour's worth that I ought to talk to you about on bibliography, but I guess you probably are just too full of excitement to want to hear that. But does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can we just see if anybody on the phone wants to ask a question? If anybody on the phone wants to ask a question.
Can they hear? Have they been able to hear me?
Perry or anybody on the phone line, do you want to ask something?
This is Perry, and I was just wondering, Roger, if you had an elevator speech for students
yes.
when they get out of school to be able to explain why their theory-based education is better than the vocational-based.
Let's see. How
an elevator speech that students can give to prospective employers or others on why their theory-based education is better than a vocational approach.
Well, I believe they must have both, but I believe the master's part of the education has to be professional. It has to involve theory. The vocational part, I think, can be done in workshops. I think can be done at the community college level, and should be. In the meantime, we do both in a graduate program, and to our peril because we don't have time to do everything properly.
I have a question. I've been trying not to go into a tangent, and so I've been thinking about this. We started off talking about this idea of knowledge doubling every 6 days, I think is what you said.
I made that up, of course.
Well, I know. But, and I'm intrigued by this notion that we still have this 4 legs of a theoretical core, and yet we've gone from the pre-mimeograph days to iPods. Yeah. And so I'm sort of amazed that we have this idea of, and also you're talking about infrastructure and the whole notion of, does anybody even care about infrastructure anymore? And
they never did before.
Okay, but if our curriculum is based on promoters of being promoters of infrastructure, that's critical that people care, or that we get people to care. And so it's struck me the analogy I want to use. The business model in the movie world right now is you release a movie, so many months later you release it on a cable and then DVD. But that's all changed. I mean, my son watches movies on his computer the same week it comes out in the theater because it's downloaded off the internet. And so and I can't remember who it is that's doing this here just pretty soon coming up, where they're going to release it in theaters, on DVD, and on cable all at the same time because the world has changed. And so I'm thinking about that in terms of our MLS curriculum.
Good, because that's...
But I'm asking you for the answer. So how do that tension between the infrastructure and the technology, really, of doing it because it can be done, and who cares about the infrastructure? Because it can be done.
I think the question is important. The answer is what we all need to address. I don't think there is a neat gimmicky answer that can add that. As you were talking, I was thinking, well, they need somehow access to a review, an opinion about this movie to decide whether it's what they want to see. But the questions are there, the issues are there. But as long as we ignore them and say it isn't something we can resolve, we're not going anyplace. We've done that for the last 150 years. And I think that's our mistake. And it's why we have not made our contribution to the social sciences that we should have. They should be different than they are because of what we could tell them. And I go through the fact that the so-called information science people invented the label descriptors for plain old subject headings during the 50s and 60s, and they were very excited about what they had done because they invented the term descriptors. And librarians would say, well, what's different? Well, see, we didn't jump on their descriptors and say, okay, that's fine, let's go here. We just reacted against it. I think the question has to be asked over and over, and when you come to that value-added component and say, maybe there's nothing we can do, and turn around and look the other way or do something else. We're more and more of our turf, our vocational turf, is being taken over by other things. And that's fine, because we weren't very good at it anyway. No, that's not true. We were very good at it. We helped win wars. We did a great deal for society. But I don't think that's going to be our contribution in the future.
One of the classes that we teach is global information infrastructure, and I taught that a couple of times. And I think, going back to Dan's comment, the challenge is that when we used to talk about information infrastructure, we talk about telecommunication systems, we talk about the technology, as you pointed out. And I think what we need to start addressing is the broader notion of information flow. How does information flow? And it could be something like teenagers getting together and chatting and passing on information about movies. So I think it's we have the class information infrastructure, but I'm wondering if that can become, talking more about like the social capabilities of using that information infrastructure, and the fact that it's not well defined in terms of technology, that it's other things that are involved. So that maybe that's another component.
I think
added
so.
to
Exactly.
The program.
It just takes somebody to say, "Hey, this is important. Let's study this. Let's move on it." And if it comes to a dead end, we've learned something. Bob and.
As Cecilia said, I think if we expand our concept of what either, if you think of information infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure especially, then information professionals are a very important part of that infrastructure.
Yeah.
And consequently, in order for information professionals to do an effective job, as you were saying, it takes that diagnosis, but at the base is caring about helping people find the answers to the questions they have, even though sometimes they can't articulate the question. It goes back to caring about people as a very important part of that infrastructure.
I was looking to see if I could put my hands on the definition of the information infrastructure by Greer, not anybody else. And I can't. I have so much that I can't find anything.
I think
I need an information manager.
Well, I think it's emphasized even more that you said before that information psychology is going to be the focus, because it focuses on people, and we are working with people and how people learn in a different society.
I believe that, but I believe that we won't know that. See, what hasn't happened that I had hoped would happen is that we would adopt a common language so that we could use terms with each other and communicate effectively, rather than constantly have to put up definition or description or what have you. That hasn't happened. There hasn't been a wholesale adoption by the profession of the language that we created with this curriculum. And I'm sorry to see that, but I think, every one of those ideas are worth doing and talking about and pursuing and being appreciated if everybody buys into the same broad theoretical framework or concept. Who knows? Myra.
I think the scenario that Dan gave us is really very powerful when you think about the fact that young people with very little education can so quickly, in a highly technologically modern way, do something with information like a movie so smoothly and so easily. But then you think about the impact of not being able to get food or water to people who are dying because of a national disaster, literally, for days on end. And you can't help but think about that really creates an even greater need to have people who are educated and trained to understand the structure of knowledge in society, and who have the people skills to get people working together, to get people communicating with each other, to get them connected in a way that when the crisis hits, people know what to do. And that seems so clear to me that that's just so missing. I taught the capstone class in Utah just a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we've been hearing is that educators and other professional people need to know more about what we're teaching our students. And so I invited some leaders in the library profession to come into the capstone class and to hear some brief presentations by the students of their capstone portfolios. And over again, and then they responded, those future employers and leaders responded to what they heard our students say that they had learned while in the program. And over I heard from them, your graduates have the knowledge and skills to get right to work when they take a new job. They know how to think, and that so often is what we don't see in new employers.
Around the building so that people see it and feel it and remember it and build on it and feel good about it. That's what the final thing that I was going to say is you've got to regenerate the excitement that we had when we were starting the new curriculum and when we came to Emporia. We were excited, and there is a cycle, a rhythm. Faculties and students start off being very excited around concepts and revise things. When I was dean at Syracuse, we started a PhD program in information transfer. We didn't know what the hell we were doing, but we were excited. Well, everybody then struggles to figure out what it is they should be contributing to the concept, and you begin to wander away from the core because you're wrapped up in what you're doing. So faculties begin to look at each other and say, well, that isn't what you should be doing. You should be teaching this. And so there is a natural progress toward, I don't want to say disintegration, but failure to communicate, failure to touch on each other's activity. And when you were talking yesterday about getting together and talking about what you're doing, the whole school needs to feel good about what's being taught in every one of these classes. And not just what, but how. What are students doing to learn? So that excitement can be recaptured. And I don't think that you lose the excitement because of any particular person. In my experience in a number of schools, it happens. and unless it's like a marriage, you have to work at it to keep it exciting. And if it isn't, you need to know it and say, what are we missing? And I think getting together and talking about your courses is a start. So that's I want to feel excitement. I think the ALA people did not feel excitement when they came here, and that's deadly. And students have to feel it. When we implemented the curriculum at the University of Southern California, we admitted a new class of about 120 or 130 students. And we told them frankly that we had a whole new curriculum, some courses that we barely understood the titles to, and that we didn't know how to do it, but we were going to learn with them by saying we're going to explore these topics with you rather than talk at you. And the students caught that excitement, and it was a very exciting time and to be. Bob Grover fled shortly after that. Came to Emporia. Okay, I've got enough. Well,
one more. Isn't too heavy for the last question, but I was wondering, in your experience as a professor and a professional, how or if you thought of yourself as a political actor, sort of. I guess the way I was getting to that, my thought process was, you've talked about the social sciences as sort of at the heart of the program, and as a master's student who I don't think now I'm going to move on to a doctoral program. I'm wondering, it seems to me that what's important too that we train people is how to use their imaginations as they proceed out of here. And one I don't see a lot of humanities at the use in the program.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if sort of the qualitative and the quantitative struggle, if there's a role more for the humanities in the program to sort of fuel people's imaginations, and if that has a sort of political component to it that programs avoid.
I think we need to rediscover the value of the humanities in the program. See, when I entered the field, to be successful was to be called a bookman, and people who were bookmen were basically bibliographers and subject or departmental librarians, people who could talk about their field and identify all the best writers and all of the best ideas and the best schools and the best places. It was a bookman's kind of thing. There was McMurtry's The Book, I think, was the big title at the time that we studied. Well, anyway, that humanities perspective meant that the best places were the biggest. Any humanities faculty member with their salt will tell you that the library should buy as much as they can, that they want everything. At Purdue, we had a chair of the Department of English who bought for years. He had access or had charge of the book budget for the English department. Purdue is a science and technology school, ag school. This guy bought second-rate English fiction, and the library had an enormous collection of what we librarians termed crap.
That's a technical word.
By the time I left Purdue, he had fashioned a PhD program anchored in that English literature, and we had the collection to support it. So that you apply certain standards and you miss the boat altogether. I don't like to diminish humanities' influence. I just want to make it a parallel with the social sciences, because the social sciences represent what we know about people and societies. Humanities is more about what we know about the individual's creativity and so on. That's kind of a sweeping statement, but kind of hints at the differences. Our business is to serve people, not to housekeep books. That's what the archivist did for 5,000 years before the 19th century. And that was important. A nation needs access to its past. But if that's all we do, they don't need us.
Roger, I'm kind of responding to that question
Good.
from the viewpoint that medicine has recognized the importance of the humanities within a medical education. And I'm thinking very practically of when I came here as a doctoral student, there was actually a list of books that faculty created and resupplied. That was,
I think I helped create that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it was heavily, at first I thought, this is fiction. Why does this exist? And then when I listened in classes and listened to my master's level students, they were talking about the ideas generated through the fiction, and that was reflected then. That brought much to bear on what we were doing to understand people. It was the discussion of the ideas that was reflected in that list. And that's what I thought of when I heard this very, very good question. I guess I wasn't thinking of the larger sphere. I was thinking about the impact on the curriculum of the humanities, the arts, which on this campus is wonderful because we have this incredible arts department and we have interesting English professors who will debate Shakespeare and ideas with you at the drop of a hat. And I think that's, again...
Shakespeare and cowboy poetry.
Exactly. So I'm almost regretting the demise of that list because I think it contributed to our understanding of the people that we were dealing with.
Our problem...
I sought it
It
out.
went away.
Part of our problem as
In the
a field
801.
is the
Jeffersonian
ideal. Ideally, we should all be Jeffersons and have an ability to interact in any area and in as much depth as possible. We can't do it. And the ideal, I think, is to have an organization where you have those components represented.
Well, I was just going to say that Prince Charles recently said in regards to human nature and technology, as what we were talking about earlier, who knows what's going to happen in 50 years, he said it's important to remember that we're the masters of our universe, and unfortunately the tail is beginning to wag the dog. So we should be the masters and creators of human nature rather than let technology overtake us and our human instincts.
I couldn't hear you all, so I don't think there was a question. You were making a statement, weren't you?
Yeah.
Where do you think information psychology fits into the future of libraries? I mean, we're kind of at a fork in the road where, we have technology here, but you were talking about students. What we really need to be doing is teaching them how to think.
Well, I think that the crux of library success in the future, libraries, information systems, not just libraries, the crux of their success will be their ability to provide value-added services. You can't do value-added without information psychology. To me, it's marketing. It's understanding your population. And if we don't make the effort, they don't need us. And when we do make it, it's like school libraries. If you have a dynamic school librarian, they make a profound difference with the curriculum in school. And everybody knows it. When I was dean at Syracuse, Cornell University Libraries was the librarian's library. Everybody pointed at Cornell. and said, this is the way an academic library should be. And it was fun to listen to their students and faculty praise the library and why they praised it. So it can be, if librarians care. In their case, they had a director who was fantastic.
To let our library be the library.
Do you think? Oh. No, she was making the sign. So.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for attending. And Roger is having a dialogue with, and Bob, I believe, is going to be here this afternoon at 1 o'clock. Is that right?
1:30.
1:30. To talk with the doctoral students about these issues. So, Roger, thank you very much. We appreciate it.